Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Thursday, the 4th of July here in London.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, a steady drumbeat of concerns turns up the pressure on President Joe Biden's bid for re-election.
President Zelenskyy challenges Donald Trump to reveal his plan for ending the war in Ukraine in an exclusive interview with Bloomberg.
Plus, it's election day in the UK. Millions head to the polls as the public have their say on the next government.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
Joe Biden has vowed to stay in the US presidential race despite mounting pressure on him to stand down. Yesterday, the New York Times reported that Biden had told an ally he was weighing up whether to continue after his performance in last week's debate raised questions about his fitness for office. But the White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, says the paper's reporting is wrong.
He's moving forward as being president. He's moving forward with his campaign, and that is the president's focus. The president's focus is how does he continue to do that work? Anything else that we're hearing or that's being reported is absolutely false.
Despite denials from the White House press secretary, the story has added to growing anxiety among Democrats that the president would lose in a head-to-head with Donald Trump. And a senior party official told Bloomberg that dozens of Democratic lawmakers are considering signing a letter demanding Biden withdraw from the race. But Biden insists he's going nowhere, and in a call alongside Vice President Kamala Harris said, "I'm in this race to the end."
Despite the growing pressure on Joe Biden, Democratic governors say that they're standing behind the president in his bid for re-election following a meeting at the White House. With more, here is Bloomberg's Ed Baxter on the governor's comments after that meeting.
Maryland Governor Wes Moore says he is convinced that Biden is in to win.
We know we have work to do. We know that as we're standing right here, we're behind. But we also know that that path to be able to make sure that we can pull ahead in November is real, and it's going to take all of us in order to make it happen and to make it work.
And Minnesota Governor Tim Walz says Biden is fit for office. New York Governor Kathy Hochul also adding support, as did Governors Gavin Newsom and Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who posted, "He's in it to win it. I support him." Ed Baxter, Bloomberg Radio.
Volodymyr Zelenskiy is challenging Donald Trump to reveal his plan for quickly ending the war with Russia. Speaking to Bloomberg, the Ukrainian president warned a US proposal to end fighting could end up violating the nation's sovereignty.
If Trump knows how to end this war, he should tell us today. Because if there are risks to Ukraine's independence, if there are risks that we will lose the statehood, we want to be prepared for this.
Ukraine's President Zelenskyy there speaking through a translator. During the US election debate last week, Trump boasted that he would end the war by the time he's inaugurated in January if he were re-elected. The former president has a fraught relationship with Zelenskyy, accusing him of corruption and pressuring him to investigate allegations against Biden.
In the general election today here in the UK, just over 6 weeks since the ballot was called, voters will have their say on the next government today, with polling stations open from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. tonight. Political parties need to secure more than half the 650 seats across the country to form a majority government. This is the first general election where voter ID will be required after new rules were introduced in 2023. Bloomberg TV and radio will have special coverage once the polls close tonight, 10 p.m, with analysis through the night on the Bloomberg terminal and website.
In France, Marine Le Pen has criticised efforts to keep her far-right party from power. Speaking to French TV station TF1, the politician denounced efforts by President Macron's centrist group and the left-wing alliance to block an absolute majority for the national rally.
I find it quite contemptuous of the political parties to consider voters a bit like things that one can move around, to whom one says do this, say that, or like children. Yes, it's always been like this, but I think the French have had enough of not being treated like responsible adults who are perfectly capable of knowing for themselves what's good for the country and what's not.
Marine Le Pen there speaking through a translator. Political groups opposed to the national rally have strategically pulled 223 candidates out of constituencies with more than 2 people in Sunday's runoff vote to avoid splitting opposition to the far right. A poll by Tanula Harris Interactive conducted this week showed the national rally and its allies on track for between 190 and 220 seats, short of the 289 needed for an outright majority.
Fed officials say that they're waiting for additional evidence that inflation is cooling. At the last meeting, policymakers were also divided on how long to keep interest rates elevated. Bloomberg's Michael McKee has more on the minutes from the Fed's June the 12th meeting.
Policymakers were divided over the effect on policy and growth. Some noted there was uncertainty about the degree of restrictiveness, with most participants viewing current rates as restrictive, while some thought they might be less so because the economy's strength showed the longer-run equilibrium interest rate was higher than previously assessed.
Mike McKee there discussing the Fed minutes. Several officials also said that a further weakening in the labour market could generate a larger increase in unemployment in those minutes. It comes as private payroll provider ADP said that American companies added 150,000 jobs last month, although that was below estimates. On Friday, we'll get the government's read on non-farm payrolls for June. Now, in a moment, more on the speculation about Joe Biden's future and the latest from the Federal Reserve on the path ahead for interest rates. But we mentioned that the UK goes to the polls today for the general election with some 46 million people eligible to vote. Broadcast rules in the UK mean that we aren't discussing the campaigning. As people go to the polls, the idea is to give voters the space to reflect on their choices as they go to the ballot box. We will, of course, have full coverage of all of the results in special programming for you beginning late this evening and then into tomorrow morning.
Well, let's get more now on the mounting pressure on US President Joe Biden to drop out of November's election. This as the White House has denied a report that Biden had conceded the possibility of quitting to a key ally. Our EMEA News Director Rosalind Matheson is with us in studio for more this morning. Good morning to you, Ros. How serious is this getting for Joe Biden?
Well, certainly the narrative is picking up speed and pretty quickly, and from a variety of quarters, not just in the media, but also, Democrat lawmakers, senior Democrat officials. And it's a narrative that will be increasingly difficult to contain. And so once it's in the psyche, it's very hard to put it back in the box. And it does seem as though there are now really serious questions being asked about Biden's stamina to go into the election, to win an election, and then to govern for another 4 years. And you can see that also by the response from the White House, from Joe Biden himself, but also his senior officials. They know that this is getting quite dangerous for him.
Yeah, absolutely. The difficulty of the White House's efforts to push back then on this speculation. So who are the key players to watch now?
Well, it's interesting to see the narrative start to coalesce around Kamala Harris, Vice President Kamala Harris. She's polling pretty well in some opinion polls against Donald Trump. She's also the natural second in line. It doesn't mean it'd be automatic. You can imagine there'd be an effort to try and get around one candidate quickly in the event that Joe Biden did step aside rather than going to a convention and having a messy kind of race going on, a competition for it. But some other names that are in a mix are some of the governors. The question is, do they have the national resonance at this point to try and gather voters together with only months before the election? Of course, those are some of the governors. Gavin Newsom, we've got J.B. Pritzker. Also, we've got Gretchen Whitmer. There's quite a lot of conversation around her. But again, these are names that may have some resonance within parts of the US, but do they have the national heft to take on Donald Trump with only months to go? So really, at this point, it seems like the conversation is mostly around Kamala Harris.
Is this a gift to Donald Trump's campaign that this continued pressure is put on Joe Biden? Because, of course, in the last time around, it was very much a campaign run as a referendum on Donald Trump's presidency.
It's very interesting because Donald Trump's gone very quiet, which is not like him. Normally, he likes to be out and about commenting, but perhaps he's showing some restraint and knowing that if he just gives the air at the moment to what's going on within the Democrats, he can let that play out. That is that quote, of course, about let them make their own mistakes and not get in the middle of that. So he's being very quiet about it, and that suggests he does know that this could be a potential gift to him in the campaign. I mean, at this point, the only conversation around the Democrats and Joe Biden, it's not his record, it's not the state of the economy, it's not foreign policy, it's not what he'd do another 4 years, it's simply about his age.
Yeah. And so, potentially others thinking about what maybe a second Trump presidency might mean. And so to the Bloomberg interview with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskiy, absolutely blunt from Zelenskyy. If you've got a plan for ending the war, tell us what it is now. And it was quite significant, his intervention, wasn't it?
It was, and it also sort of shows a pragmatism on the part of Zelenskyy in that interview with Anne-Marie Houdin, that he knows he may be dealing with a Trump presidency, and he knows that he needs to get a sense quickly of what that would look like. He and Donald Trump have a pretty fraught history. I mean, Donald Trump has accused Zelenskyy of corruption, essentially, and has also been very critical of the war, not Russia invading Ukraine, but the war itself. And so he would need to reset that relationship. He also needs any sense that weapons and aid would continue to come from the US. I mean, Trump is also oddly pragmatic when he needs to be. He does what is best for him in the minute, and Zelenskyy does recognise that. And so you could see a way perhaps where they could have a proper conversation. And if he can convince Donald Trump of certain things, and Donald Trump think that's in his best interest, then he might just go for it.
OK, Rosalind Matheson, our EMEA News Director, thank you very much for joining us.
Now, the minutes of the last Federal Reserve meeting show that officials said that they are awaiting additional evidence that inflation's cooling, that they were also divided on how long to keep interest rates elevated. Treasuries rallied also after new data showed that the US labour market is continuing to cool and declines also in the services sector. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Garfield Reynolds, who leads our Markets Live team in Asia, to discuss and have a think about those minutes. Garfield, good morning. What exactly do you think we learnt from those minutes, 12th of June meeting?
Well, I think we learned, most importantly, that there's a bit of a crack opening up there, quite a division. We had 4 FOMC members who were penciling in 0 cuts, and then 8 that were looking at 2. So the one cut that was, the official dot plot, it sort of stresses the idea that that's almost like you're caught between like not doing 0 or 2, and it's a 1 is kind of what you landed on. And there was a lot of emphasis on that patience that's needed, because they were obviously very concerned about the revival in inflationary pressures that became apparent in the early stages of this year. And at the same time, there was also an increase in the level of concern about the potential for the labour market to turn sour very rapidly. There have been some indications that the labour market is softening, and I think a lot of the FOMC members are aware that in previous downturns, when the labour market turns soft, it turns soft very, very rapidly, and there's often a very quick shift from jobs growth to job losses, and that's exactly the sort of quick shift that they want to avoid as they continue to target a so-called soft landing for the economy.
Well, of course, we've been hearing from a couple of Fed policymakers. They've been in Sintra at the ECB Central Banking Forum there as well. How does what we've heard in the past couple of days, I suppose, add to the detail that's in those minutes?
Well, I mean, the main thing that was added was that there's some level, Powell, for example, did say that the more recent data releases have been on the right path. They're still overall saying that it's going to take more time for them to be confident that inflation is under control, but they're moving. They do see what's been going on with the data pulse as signaling that they can they can see that there's the potential. They will be confident, perhaps a bit sooner than they might have thought that was going to be that tipping point, even just a couple of weeks ago, let alone 6 weeks ago or so.
There have also been pretty big moves in Treasury yields, haven't there? And we've also got the big jobs report coming out on Friday. So how do we factor that in?
The political turmoil has definitely sent yields up as investors account for better chances that Trump will win and institute policies that might be inflationary or might swell the deficit and drive long-term yields up. So that helped to set the Treasury market up for a strong rally on the weak data that came out yesterday. So did the shortened session that we had. But also, the market is looking ahead to the three big events in the coming week or so that will help to give them a better guide as to what's going to go on. And that's jobs this Friday. Then next week we have Powell speaking to Congress. And then after that, we get the inflation data. So that those are really, really key. And if we get a continuation of the trend on the data that we've seen, and Powell continues the trend towards a slightly softer stance that we've seen from Fed speakers, then you could see a really serious Treasury rally coming through, all other things being equal.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.